Boardroom Bound, episode 133, Cultivating Appropriate Responses to Environmental, Social, and Governance Issues, with Helle Jorgensen.
You can't deliver the long-term results if you don't have the right short-term decisions. And I think that's another thing we need to understand, that we need to balance all of these different, being that the environmental, the social, the governance, but also the economic and many other areas.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Helle Jorgensen, and she's a global recognized sustainability, climate change, and ESG advisor with 30 years of experience. She leads the Competent Boards organization, and this is the type of organization boards are seeking out these days because after the last year plus of being in COVID, ESG is at the forefront of most boards' mind, and many boards before would probably say they weren't doing it as well, giving enough time and attention. Every board seems to be handling the topic differently. So we're going to jump into that day and have a great teaching lesson on it. Helle Jorgensen, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
And as we were joking before the show started, I did that in my best Danish accent, which is not very good. So I'm clearly not pronouncing it correctly. Let's have you do it in your native tongue. It sounded so much better.
Oh, in my native, that would be Helle Jorgensen.
Lovely.
That is a hard one to say.
Much better than I did it. Well, I am delighted to have you on the show today. I've been admiring the Competent Boards work that you guys are doing, and I am excited to bring this to our audience today because when we think about, say, ESG and sustainability and climate change, this is at the forefront of what everyone is thinking about today, even if they weren't before COVID started over a year ago. It is something that's on our minds today. So I'm excited to dig into this with you and just to sort of set the scene and help people understand it because you did a whole bunch of stuff before you were the CEO and founder of Competent Board, including all the work you did at PwC for about 2 decades. So give us a bit of an overview of your career trajectory.
Oh my, yes. Actually, I did start 30 years ago creating the first green account in the world. And later on, the first integrated report also in the world. So worked with global leaders, worked with board of directors, worked with companies in terms of both the what we now call ESG, so environment, social, governance issues, their supply chain issues, et cetera, et cetera. I am a business lawyer as well as state authorized public accountant by training. That would be the same as a CPA, so an accountant. So I bring both the law and the accountant profession to the whole world of ESG, which I actually think is very important so we can learn to trust the information, but also have some information that people can use to make informed decisions. So fantastic 30 years, both in Denmark and in the U.S. and now in Canada and working with global companies. And as you said, many of those years with PwC, where I was a partner first in Denmark and then in the U.S. And
so Competent Boards coming up on about 3 years. Tell us how that came about and what you're focused on.
Yes. So it came about because, as I said, I've been working with so many global leaders and board of directors, but I was frankly getting a little bit frustrated that I found that if I did not have the board of directors engaged in the work when working with a company, change did not stick as much as it did if the board of directors were involved. So at that point, I talked to the board chair of Unilever at that point, as well as the CEO of Unilever, Paul Pullman, and then the board chair, Michael Tresco, as well as many other leaders and said, if I could scale your impact and your insight and bring that to other board members and other executives all over the world, would you help me? And the answer was yes. And based on that, we started the ESG Competent Board Certificate Program. So I had these global leaders support me, help me in terms of figuring out what are the most material topics that we should cover, but also by sharing their insight and their experience with all of these board of directors and executives that's now going through the program. So we now have over 100 global leaders that are contributing, and many more that are going through the program. And as I said, from time to time, it's really getting not only the insight but also the foresight on environmental, social governance issues, but we also cover, responsible use of data and cybersecurity. We cover issues in terms of course, human rights, but also anti-corruption and transparency. So it's kind of like the mindset around the whole ESG space, and that's what I found. That if you don't have that, you're losing some of the impact that you can have, but you're actually also leaving money on the table because you don't get the innovation, you don't get the savings that you can do if you really think through this whole ESG space and have real ESG integration.
You made a very interesting comment there that was very brief, and I'd love to talk about it a bit more, about the change doesn't stick if the board's not involved. And there might be some people thinking, well, the type of stuff you're talking about is a conversation that happens with the CEO and the C-suite, and whether the board is involved probably doesn't matter as much. So you've touched on something really important, and I believe you've got a good story from this at Davos, right?
Oh, yes. And you're referring to that, when, as you said, when we started the competent boards movement, as we actually called it at that point, in Davos in 2019, I wanted to engage the board of directors, but I found that a lot of people were telling me, well, why engage the board of directors? This is the role of the CEO. And I completely agree. But if you don't have the governance, you often see that E, so environmental projects, S, the social project, will stay as projects instead of being part of the governance process, and therefore really stick. And I think one of the most important issues is the culture. And if we don't really have the G, so the governance aspect, again, we don't really see that the changes that's happening really stick and be supported, being funded by board of directors that have the oversight and therefore can give that insight, but also help management to drive this the way it should.
It's interesting. When I reflect back on my prior role being at JP Morgan, my final role was helping lead the corporate social responsibility group. And Jamie Dimon, who was the chairman and the CEO, big fan of it. It was his agenda. He was pushing it forward. And so he's doing it both the board level and the C-suite. But we knew for a fact that half of his C-suite members believed in it and the other half didn't. Some thought it was an absolute waste of money. This was just marketing. This was just PR. Now, that conversation would probably be very different today. And I imagine you're seeing this across the landscape of organizations you talk to. Some are probably moving faster than others, but COVID has probably changed the way we frame these discussions. Is that fair?
Indeed. I think we can say that COVID, the pandemic, shined a light that have a lot of people look at this and saying, oh, we were perhaps a little bit too efficient. We had perhaps looked too much to say, how do we have the most efficient supply chain? How do we have the most efficient way we're driving things? And perhaps forgot the human aspects, but also forgot that what happens if suddenly we can't get our supply from one supplier? If we so efficient that we can't get it from anywhere else, well, then that can actually hurt our business or close the business. So I think the pandemic have really shined this light on all the things that we're used to saying, okay, this is the way we do business, and have changed it. And some of it has been changed for the better, where we say, hey, we can do things in different ways. We can work from home. We can do where we have a feeling of more care for our employees, for our customers, etc. That shows that now they come back with loyalty. So we can start building a trust in a different way. And I think that's been one of the things that I've been saying from the start of the pandemic, that cash is still king. But if you don't have the care, so the care as the queen or whatever you want to say, you will be losing in the long run. People in need have long memories. So if you don't help those people that when they are in need, do you expect that they will come back and help you later? And I think that's one of the things that the pandemic have been very, shown a very clear signal.
And when I stand back, if I were trying to summarize some of the stuff that you're sharing and the approach and perspective, I guess I would talk about is that the board probably has an innate responsibility to deliver on a shared vision that drives long-term sustainable value creation while executing on short-term needs. Is that a good way to think about it?
Indeed. And I think many of the board chairs and others that I would say, you can't deliver the long-term, results if you don't have the right short-term decisions. So it is a balance. And I think that's another thing we need to understand, that we need to balance all of these different, being that the environmental, the social, the governance, but also the economic and many other areas.
And this is not just our discussion here. For example, you guys had a recent report about the Future Boardroom Competencies report that you shared, and there's some really interesting nuggets. I'd love to dig into it today. And I suppose the context, I would say, before we open up that box and share the results that come out of it, is that board members today are traveling across a business landscape that's vastly different than we've ever seen before. So that you've got the acceleration of globalization, proliferation of technology, elevated urgency surrounding climate change and biodiversity loss. Oh, and by the way, there's the backdrop about the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a really interesting time that we're living in, if we can use that word to describe it. So if I use that to sort of open up the report, I'd love for you to share with us some of the great stuff that came out of it.
Definitely. So we wanted to look at what should the future boardroom competencies be. Exactly, you said why. All of these changes that is happening right now. So we basically went out to all of our global faculties of these over 100 global board members, executives, investors, etc., as well as others, and asked 4 questions. So we said, what does stewardship in the 21st century look like? We asked, what does a future prepared board member look like? And we said, what new competences are or should be demanded of board members? And finally, we also asked about the personal traits. So what are the personal traits? What are the qualities? What are the diverse perspectives that's needed in the boardroom? And all of that, it goes back to exactly what you say, that it's a different world we're living in. The stewardship that's expected from board members today is very, very different than it was, not that long ago. And you can say it's also different what's expected by you and by me now than it was not that long ago. But I think the board members are really feeling that there are so many issues that's coming at them 24/7, and having that way of looking at things needs to be in a way that's driven by the value and values, so that they can make informed decisions. So we basically went out and asked about all of this and got so many answers back, And we try to say, how do we make sense of all of this information that we get? And you could go in and say, well, integrity, 90% thinks integrity is important, but that does not really make sense. So what we did instead was actually we took all of this insight that we got and provided that in more infographic. So to show the readers of the report, and happy to, of course, share that, that what are those characteristics that they perhaps should look at and say, okay, do we have those in the boardroom? How can we achieve these competencies, but also this way of looking at things in a much more holistic way? So we ended up with four questions, so 4 infographics, where one is this in terms of stewardship in the 21st century, where we have a person that's very much about purpose. It's very much about the communities, accountability, stewardship, relationships, awareness, a lot of kind of like words in that sense, but then that this person is kind of like in a global setting and have both what we have at the infographic, both a brain, a heart, and a hand. And if I start with the brain, that's what, to the question, what does a future prepared board member look like? And words that came was open listener, adaptive, strategy purpose-driven, emotionally intelligent, ability to prioritize, culture-driven, integrity, transparent, accountable, long-term focus, just to, some of the things that you were also mentioning before. While when we started to look at the competences, so more this hand, what is it that you should have? What is the competences you should have? ESG, so environment, social governance, stakeholder focus, high standard of ethics, sustainable development goals, climate, supply chains, technology, cybersecurity, but also the ability to challenge and having this transformational leadership and be able to make sense of things. So very much kind of like, okay, tools that reason why we had the hand. And then if I may, just the last one in terms of the heart, where we say what are the personal traits and qualities and these diverse perspectives needed in the boardroom. And the words there were curious, should not be strange to anyone, but also words such as inclusive, committed to diversity and equity, having courage, having the innovative and creative mindset, having empathy, being pragmatic, being wise, being humble, and then entrepreneurship, which was a very interesting one for me, but makes a ton of sense to say board of directors today with so much happening needs to have this entrepreneurship mindset in saying we might not have tried this before. We might not have been in this situation before. Think the pandemic. How do we go about that? And I think there's so many very interesting findings in a relatively short report, if I may say it myself, that really can help board members, but also future board members say, do we have these competences, these qualities in the boardroom? Or is this something we could look at and develop in the years to come?
Well, I will reinforce just the one point. I think it's only like 12 pages. This is a quick and easy read, so it's not like some of the 100-page dense ones that I get. So in that sense, it's very easy to digest. And it's really interesting when you get to the end and some of the nuggets that you take away there. There's a wonderful call to action where you're looking for people to suggest other individual board members and or entire boards that you really believe fit that sort of top 100 ESG competency. So tell us a bit about that.
Definitely. And yes, you're right. And we actually have two calls to actions. One is, please let us know if there's any qualities, competencies missing, because this is a living document, and there'll be a new one coming out here again later in 2021. But this top 100 is because I believe in role models. And I believe that if we have a list of the top 100 ESG competent board members and the top 100 ESG competent boards, that will help us all to kind of like define what does the future of good corporate governance in terms of also the ESG, how does that look like? So a call to action is to nominate a company's board or an individual board member to be part of this top 100 ESG competent boards or top 100 ESG competent board members. You might know that I was asked to comment on a report about the boardroom competencies when it came to ESG, and found that 17% of board members serving on committees overseeing sustainability or ESG had these competences, at least where you could read it on in the report or the website, that they had the competences to have the oversight of ESG. I went out and said that, what if we only had 17% of those board members serving in audit committees that were able to read the P&L or income statement and balance sheet? And being an accountant myself, I would say, or auditor, that would not go down well. So I'm hoping that we can start seeing all of these competences, and via the ESG Competent Board Certificate Program, I know that we are going to have more and more people with these competences, and hoping to really see that the competences in the boardroom will then result in better governance, but better decisions, and therefore also better future for the companies.
And it's interesting, if I were to summarize it back to make sure everyone in the audience can understand, when we think about ESG, this is something that every board is wrestling with at a different stage in the journey, and they're approaching it from different ways. You can just imagine where in the governance structure of a board. It might be in this committee here and this committee there. They have different names, they have different responsibilities. So there is no common language that we can all define. So everyone thinking about this and spending more time on it is important, because we've seen over the last year just how much more important this is as a topic that every organization needs to be wrestling with. So I'm glad that you guys are putting out the right information, and I think your board certification program will add a lot of value to it. And I imagine there are ways that people can think about how to sign up and participate in this.
Oh, definitely. We have a program coming up, or programs actually coming up here in May 21, where we'll start one for board of directors and one for business executives, business professionals, and of course can sign up on our website, which would be www and then competentboards.com.
And we'll make sure we have links to that in the show notes. And Helle, we were sort of joking about Davos and how people thought about it then. And I imagine whenever we can get back to normal Davos, whatever it looks like in the future going forward, if you had those conversations now, everyone would sort of be marching around with you side by side going, yes, we're behind this. So what's it like when you go talk to a board today about climate change, sustainability, ESG, whatever the flavor might be for that discussion? What does it look and feel like now versus what it was a few years ago?
There's clearly an urgency, and you have the Black Rocks of the world that's asking board of directors as well as executives on showing their transition plans and showing what they're doing, and clearly that puts the urgency at the board level as well as the C-suite. So there's a full understanding that this is not something that's nice to have anymore. This is a need to have. The next is, of course, so what to do about it. And everyone want to get out at the moment with commitment. But where I think the good boards, they really understand the subject matter and really ask the questions, so they are sure that the plan that they are putting out there to the world, as well as their commitment, that the accountability is there, that they really have understanding of how they're going to reach those goals. I'm not saying that they need to have the answer on all of it, because I do believe that putting a goal, setting a man on the moon or a woman on the moon, that's a goal you need to have. But you do need to not only just say, oh yes, we put that out there, and then the fear of greenwashing at the moment is very, very high. And I think it's important for board of directors to really understand the subject matter and understand how we're going to reach it and be able to ask the right questions.
Well, I feel like today we've talked about, say, essential board member skills, which is clearly becoming more skilled in the ESG area, understanding it, being effective, operating in it. And probably one of the biggest boardroom challenges is figuring out how to address that, which certainly varies by industry, maybe varies by some companies within the industry. So, Helle, let's sort of take that as we've changed a lot over the last certainly year and a half with COVID. And let's look further into the future. If you pull out your crystal ball, when we think about the future of the boardroom, how these things are going to change and continue to evolve, what would you say?
It's a very interesting question, and you can say, I don't think, as I said, ESG issues, that's just going to be hopefully an integral part of everything, and I think we're already getting there. However, you can start arguing, what else? How will the boardroom look like in terms of diversity? How will the boardroom look like in terms of the insight that's being brought on? Is this where we would see artificial intelligence being utilized around the boardroom table? Is this where we can see that we have insight in different ways that help the board of directors really make those informed decisions? And have that foresight. I think we will see a very different activity level also around the boardroom, where it is that it is very much asking questions and assisting, helping, steering the companies in the right direction.
Well, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping us all be more boardroom bound on these very important topics.
Well, thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Helle Bank-Jorgensen, and it was wonderful to hear her expert opinion on all things ESG, sustainability, climate. These are topics we're all wrestling with today. We're thinking, what's the right thing to do? How do we go about it? Boards are struggling to tackle this. We have been struggling for a long time. And her future boardroom competencies report leads some great insights that we can all glean from that. And if you head over to podcast.gordon.eu, you'll find a link to that report and other resources that we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.